Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families wherever you're located on this God's green earth. In this episode of the Real Talks with Amini, I am honored to have Dr. Bashir Mobasher, lecturer at American University as well as at in New York University. And we will be talking with him on various aspects of the current crisis in Afghanistan. Dr. Saib, welcome to our show. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to interview you, to speak with you, and discuss various issues with you. Maybe we can start by having your description of the current situation in Afghanistan. How do you define the current state of affairs in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this very prominent platform. And it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you because I always enjoy talking with you about different topics, including particularly about Afghanistan and what's going on there. As for your question goes, there's a lot to talk about when you're talking about Afghanistan, particularly under the Taliban and the atrocities that are happening in there. A couple of things, if I have to talk about, one thing that comes to mind is gender apartheid. Afghanistan is a gender apartheid state under the Taliban. And when I talk about gender apartheid, what I mean is basically a systemic regime of suppression which is based on segregation along gender lines, where a certain set of rules and regulations are applied to women, which is very different from the laws and regulations that are adopted and applied to men, and which basically oppress women systematically in Afghanistan. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing that comes to mind is that Afghanistan is emerging once again as a hub for extremism and terrorism, and not just for the international extremist forces who have a very hot, desirable destination in Afghanistan to go and learn and get indoctrinated into extremism, and then bringing those extremism to around the globe, but it also has become a hub for indoctrination of Afghan populations into extremism through the education system and through the apparatus of the state. And the last thing I would say is that given the way that the Taliban are operating in Afghanistan and the situation in Afghanistan, and given the history of Afghanistan, we can only predict that the civil and political resistance is only going to increase in Afghanistan should the Taliban continue their ruling of Afghanistan this way.
Mm-hmm. And how do you assess the Taliban's governance structure? Can it even be called a government? They're referred to by our international allies as de facto government. Is it a government?
Well, in my mind, I tend to avoid using the word government to the Taliban for a couple of reasons. The first reason is they don't have a domestic legitimacy. And secondly, they do not have an international recognition. And thirdly, it's a terrorist organization, a terrorist political group, just because the United States or the international community has engaged with the Taliban, made a deal with the Taliban, does not necessarily make the Taliban any less extremist or less terrorist group. And if you apply the term and the concept of government to a terrorist organization, then basically you, at the same time that you delegitimize every form of government, you start legitimizing and normalizing a terrorist and extremist regime, which I think is a dangerous step to take for both Afghans and international community.
Mm-hmm. What are the common forms of discrimination right now in Afghanistan? You mentioned the gender apartheid. What about other forms of discrimination based on religion, belief systems, ethnicity, or geography, or tribes, and other forms of discrimination in Afghanistan?
The first thing that I have to say about discrimination in Afghanistan is that it has always existed in this country. The first thing we need to do, if we want to deal with the issue of discrimination, that we have to acknowledge it, that throughout the history of Afghanistan, we have had various forms of discrimination: gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, linguistic, religious, and all other forms of discrimination in Afghanistan. Now, what has happened under the Taliban, that this discrimination has become more systematic and has become more violent. So gender discrimination has turned into gender apartheid. Ethnic discrimination has turned into ethnic persecution. Religious discrimination has turned into forced conversion of various groups or their displacement from Afghanistan, or imposing various forms of special taxes on these different groups. For example, there are different villages in the north of Afghanistan where Ismaili religious groups live, and where the Taliban actually forced these population, these communities, to convert into the Talibanic version of Islam, because they don't consider Ismailis as Muslims. And if you listen to a number of prominent figures within this movement, you hear that they also believe that the Shiites, the Jafaris, are not Muslim as well, and therefore they impose the special taxes and try and treat them very badly, in fact persecute Hazaras. So what I can say is that right now this discrimination has existed in the history of the country, but now the government itself is the author of discrimination, various forms of discrimination. And this discrimination has become more systemic. It has become part and parcel of the policy of the ruling group.
Mm-hmm. And what about the human rights of the people of Afghanistan? Of course, there's a lot of violations and the way they are dealing and treating the people of Afghanistan and all types of different categories of people of Afghanistan. But what about the international community? What strategies can they employ in order to counter these violations or address some of these violations?
Well, I have human rights is an area which I am very interested in. I've invested a lot of my time. I've done a little bit of research on that. International relations and international community is not necessarily my area of expertise. I'm a little bit more cautious on that part. When it comes to human rights, it's a set of intrinsic human values. We all have it, and the idea is that no one should breach those values, those sort of norms and rights, whether they're government or non-government actors. And the Taliban are a non-government terrorist organization that currently is ruling Afghanistan, unfortunately. But when it comes to the international community, I have a very much lower expectation of the international community. I have come to the conclusion, and that's, as I said, that's based on my personal observation rather than, gathering information and knowledge about this, is that the international community, when they're not as much invested when it comes to human rights in different parts of the world. When they're talking about human rights, it's either that they're talking about the rights of their own citizens, or they're using it as a fancy term just to create a different image that they have around the world. And a really good example of that is the Taliban. The United States made a deal with the Taliban, knowing that the Taliban have violated human rights, knowing that the Taliban do not respect human rights. They still made a deal with them, and still a lot of funds are going to the Taliban. And therefore, I do not have a lot of expectations from the international community. So if we want to improve human rights in Afghanistan, I think we need to rely on our own potentials and our own resources. We need to get united. We need to get together, get along, collaborate with each other. I know that Afghans are very active on this issue. They have done a lot of advocacy. A little bit they're dispersed, a little bit they're scattered. We need to get united on this particular front if we want to improve it. But we for sure can do a little bit of advocacy, particularly with the countries who at least claim that they want to promote human rights across the globe and they want to promote human rights in Afghanistan. But also we have to reach out to individual members of the international community, and by individual members, the citizens of these different communities, who are the professors, who are veterans, who have served in Afghanistan, who have worked in Afghanistan. They are still friends of Afghanistan. They have the same ideas because they have seen our struggles, they have seen our resilience, and they want to be part of our resistance. We can definitely engage them, and through them we can engage these different countries that at least claim to promote human rights around the world. But also we can work with the international organizations like International Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and various United Nations human rights organizations that are invested on human rights as a cause. And I have to make a distinction here between various international organizations as well as Afghan organizations on human rights. For some international organizations, human rights is a cause, so they fight for the cause. They advocate for the cause, they lobby for the cause, and they fight for the cause. Some other international and Afghan organizations and NGOs are more kind of monetary driven organizations. So for them, human rights is a secondary purpose, a secondary priority than the money. So as long as they get funds, and there are a number of them that are operating in Afghanistan, they can justify the situation in Afghanistan because they have to show to whatever foundation or whatever government they receive funds from that they have made some progress. So they have to normalize the situation in Afghanistan so that they can keep receiving funds. But at the same time, we know that the situation is actually getting worse and worse by each decree that's being issued by the Taliban on Afghanistan. So that distinction, I think, is very important. And we have to be cautious about who we want to approach with if we want allies, international allies, on the particular issue of human rights.
Yes. Unfortunately, as you stated, some of our Afghans are involved in this. They have some NGOs, some projects, some initiative, and they keep receiving funding and on human rights front, however, but they keep on undermining that cause by legitimizing the discriminatory policies of the Taliban or giving reasoning for that and all that, trying to justify what they are trying to do there just because they want to keep their offices open. And as you stated rightly, of course, our true allies are the veterans or the individual members of the international community, friends of Afghanistan throughout the world, who have served in Afghanistan, who have been engaging with Afghan communities. And since the collapse of the Afghan republic system and the recapturing of power by the Taliban, they were the ones who were basically on the front lines of the media and think tank space and socialist space and political space, advocating on behalf of the Afghans and on behalf of Afghan women. And we are grateful to have them, and we appreciate them very much. And we will keep working with them, and hopefully they will. Some of them will end up being in decision-making positions, and hopefully we'll see some changes there. You mentioned about the Afghans and our responsibilities and how we need to unify ourselves. Unlike the 1996, the first time around when the Taliban came and took over power, that we had a government in exile and there was an active resistance in the north of the country. This time around, the former officials and former leaders have not been able to form a government in exile. Why do you think they have not been able to do so?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's $1 million question as well. So I will try to answer it to best of my ability. I think a number of things have changed since then. The first thing is that all these leaders, so-called leaders of Afghanistan, they had fighting forces before the Taliban took over Afghanistan. So they had some fighting capabilities at that particular time. The second thing they had was they were much more risk takers at that particular time because most of their lifetime they were fighting actually. Even before the Taliban took over, they were fighting each other. They were fighting each other and killing each other, and therefore they were familiar with the battlefield. They were on the battlefield, and they were much more kind of risk taker at that particular time. They could lead actually war in different fronts at that particular time, and that has changed recently because during the Republic regime. Within the 20 years, they gave up most of their arms. They had lost most of their fighting forces. Instead, they started, accumulating wealth through, corruption, various forms of looting of all those resources that were coming Afghanistan's way. And now they have built houses, not just inside Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan. They have beautiful houses. In Turkey, in Dubai, in the United States, in Europe, and so on. They have big families, they have kids. So right now, they love their life a lot, and they do not want to take as much of a risk. So if you're thinking about someone who has to stop resisting the Taliban, it has to be someone from within the country who take a lot of risk in order to establish themselves as a leader of the country. So that's another thing. The other factor I would say is that they didn't have at that particular time, we did have like a charismatic figure, like Ahmad Shah Massoud. He was not necessarily a political charisma or a charismatic leader or a charismatic politician because, well, he wasn't able to avoid the civil war in Afghanistan. In fact, he was leading one of the warring factions in Afghanistan, but he was a charismatic fighting individual, a fighting leader who could bring these various factions around him and form a coalition and started resisting, having an active resistance inside Afghanistan. Now that charismatic leader, at least a charismatic fighter, is right now missing. Ahmad Massoud has tried to establish himself, but still a lot of these old guards do not trust him because, first of all, he's much younger than they are. Secondly, he didn't have a lot of, he tested battlegrounds very recently, in Panjshir, and they think the old guards think that they are, if there has to be a leader of an opposition to the Taliban, it has to be them, and then they are divided on who that particular leader is. So even that particular time when they fought the government was inside Afghanistan. So it was moving around, but it still was inside Afghanistan. But today we are talking about the government in exile, and itself is a very new concept to all these figures who call themselves the elites of Afghanistan. But at the same time, so all those elements that existed in 1996 do not exist now. So for example, the fighting forces, right now we have two prominent factions that are fighting inside Afghanistan, like the Resistance Front, and then we have the Jabhat al-Azadi, the Freedom Fighting Front. I hope I titled them properly. But there are a bunch of other factions as well that are emerging in Afghanistan. They are trying to find a foothold inside the country. Secondly, these leaders are no longer risk takers, so they are unlikely to go back inside Afghanistan and establish a front. If they do, they're going to find some fighting forces, but they are not going to take those risks. And third, they don't have a charismatic leader at this particular time, which in one way can be an advantage for this group because instead of surrounding themselves around a particular charismatic leader, they can actually work on building institutions. And then within that institutions, they can start their resistance against the Taliban. And government in exile is a new concept, and a lot of intellectuals who are familiar with this concept and who can actually work with these opposition group, in general, forming an opposition group who then form an alternative government to the Taliban, they are not as much interested in working with these political elites who at least claim to be the opposition forces to the Taliban.
Right, right. And how do you assess comparatively the women leaders and the young leaders of Afghanistan who have come about and they are trying to fill the vacuum from the old guards who have basically failed to the task? They failed the republic, and now more than 3 years they've failed to unify in order to have a proper opposition to the Taliban. What do you think? Is the environment facilitated for the emergence of new figures as political figures for Afghans?
Well, I would say yes and no at the very same time. I think the new generation of Afghans who have turned mostly diaspora, I think they're more active. They advocate for the women's rights cause, but also for everyone else's rights cause around the globe. They are very much active. They have published a lot. They are more knowledgeable. They are more educated. But there are a number of barriers for them in order to find the right, I would say, the appropriate position that they seek in order to be influential, basically. And these barriers include the tribalism that has still continued, even among the diasporas. We're still divided along ethnic lines, tribal lines, linguistic lines, and even gender lines, and so on. And at the same time, there's a lack of trust between people, even the intellectuals. There's trust deficiency among the intellectuals. We are all sort of Afghan intellectuals are secretive, they're confidential, they have their own groups, they don't want to engage other groups. So we lack the energy and the proper approach to reach out to each other, to engage each other, to collaborate with each other, share our ideas, see what we can do together, because we can't do it alone on ourselves and by our own small groups and things like that. And the other barrier I would say is that even we are exclusive in one way. Like I've talked to a lot of Afghan youths and Afghan academics and intellectuals inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan who think that these groups of people shouldn't be in the future of Afghanistan, or even these warlords should not be part of the alternative to the Taliban or part of the opposition. If they are, then we are not going to be part of this particular movement. So basically, we are trying to do the same thing that these old guards did. They tried to exclude the educated, exclude the intellectuals, exclude the youth. And now the youth are trying to do the same thing. But the important matter for Afghanistan is that every one of us is a citizen of Afghanistan. And these old guards, whether you like them or not, they have some popularity and they have their own constituencies. So you cannot exclude them. Neither they should be able to exclude you because, as I said, most of the youth in Afghanistan are very much more knowledgeable and educated. They know about Afghanistan much more, and they know about the world, and they know about the governance structure, governance system, human rights, and all those things much better than elder generation. And therefore, they have to be included in Afghanistan. And obviously, excluding people based on their ethnicity, religious, and gender or linguistic backgrounds is already, I don't really have to talk about it. That's problematic. So I think we need to overcome these problems that we have, start thinking about trusting each other rather than trying to put a sort of a blind trust on some international state actors. I think it's better to trust a little bit more each other and cross those ethnic and tribal boundaries and try to be a little bit more inclusive in a sense that think people you do not like, but you must understand they have some constituency, and therefore, instead of trying to exclude everyone, I think the best way is to include all people who are part of Afghanistan. You may not share their ideas, you may not even share their values and their agendas, but we have learned throughout the history, exclusion of any particular group, no matter how big or how small they are, has always led to the collapse of regimes, and we don't want to keep that going. And we have to break that cycle, that chain of cycle. And that's being a little bit more, not a little bit, sufficiently, or I would say a lot more inclusive in our politics towards the country.
I think we need to, we all need to agree on fundamentals that unite us, that unify us, on some core principles that distinguishes us from the Taliban terrorists. And since we are all in opposition, we are all standing on the other side of the aisle. So we need to unify our forces in order to get rid of this Taliban terrorists. And there is no other way to get rid of the Taliban unless we all unify and then join our forces, no matter what differences we have. And there isn't much differences. We just need to accept each other as equals. And I think a lot of our issues will be resolved, and also be able to be open to the best idea to the table. And the best people to deliver those ideas, to implement those ideas. I think it wouldn't be much, and we will be hopefully we're working on this, so we will resolve this. How do you assess the women's movement? You know, since the 2021, these are the fighters on the front line. These are the primary opposition group against the Taliban, challenging the Taliban. And when we're calling about the resistance, these are the real resistance against the Taliban. Since day one, bravely they're fighting Taliban on the streets of Kabul, as well as the capitals around the world, and how they've influenced international community's perspective towards the Taliban. And they are having a lot of groups, they're having meetings, their sessions, and coordinating their messages and their activities, and they're emerging like a real political force for change in Afghanistan. And it seems the Taliban have also gotten the wind of it, because most of their policies and rules and regulations are against the women of Afghanistan. What do you think?
Well, as you said, I think women are leading the civil resistance against the Taliban. There's no question about that. You know, inside Afghanistan, they have taken a lot of casualties. They have made a lot of sacrifices, much more sacrifices that men did or has done in Afghanistan under the Taliban. They have been much more courageous in terms of, you know, getting out on the streets, protesting against the Taliban, but also initiating various other forms of protest against the Taliban. But outside Afghanistan, again, there are a lot of women who are very much active. They have advocated in front of international organizations, including the United Nations, but they have also kept their advocacy going on across the world. They have also keep on helping and assisting Afghan women inside Afghanistan in terms of providing them education, providing them jobs, providing them other various forms of support that Afghan women actually need inside Afghanistan. So, kudos to women of Afghanistan. I think, we need to start learning from them. We need to start supporting them and be an ally in this fight against the Taliban. Because historically, we have Afghanistan is a patriarchal society, always thought of women doing less and being less than men. But today women has proved that they can actually do much better job than men can do in Afghanistan, and that's something that make us proud, but also pushes us to do more, be part of the coalitions, and keep the resistance against the Taliban stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and coming back to the international community and their engagement with Afghanistan, given they've invested, so much in the past 20 years during the Republic time, how do you assess their role right now since the Taliban come back, and what do you think they can do on their part to help Afghans in order for us to restore our democracy? in Afghanistan, and to be able to challenge the Taliban. The Taliban, once they were just an armed insurgency, at some point they got an office in Doha, and that was they didn't achieve it on their own. It was facilitated for them, and so some Afghans expect that similar generosity could be extended to the pro-democracy Afghans as well. Maybe we could have an office outside a political office to be able to organize our activities, particularly Afghan women. If they could have an office, I think that could elevate their activities. Do you see a particular role for international community in restoring our democracy?
I would like to take a slightly different take on this particular issue, looking at the history of the country. Always the rulers of Afghanistan, one of the problems of Afghanistan has always been that we have always built a rentier state, where our rulers, instead of seeking domestic legitimacy, they have always sought international and foreign legitimacy. Or either they sought legitimacy, for example, from the British India or Russia, the Soviet Union or United States or some other countries, instead of actually seeking domestic and local legitimacy. I think what I would suggest is, as an Afghan, that instead of prioritizing engaging with the international community, I'm not against that. I'm not against engaging with the international community, particularly if you find some really good allies. And I do think there are some good allies in the United States, in Europe, in the region around Afghanistan, and we need to engage them, and we need to, bring them along on this very important cause that I think is very much shared globally. Democracy, human rights, it's a global shared value. But I would prioritize engaging Afghans, whether it's the civil movements in Afghanistan or the political movements in Afghanistan. We need to engage Afghan communities outside Afghanistan and inside Afghanistan. We have a huge potential. We have a lot of educated energies around the globe who can actually work with these movements and make them better and more effective and more influential. And once you establish that political core, that civil core, you automatically encourage and attract international attention. So, for example, one of the things you mentioned, establishing an office, I don't know, in the United States or wherever. If we want to establish an office, let's build an office. Let's do not ask someone, United States or whoever. Let's build an office, give it a momentum, make it a very influential office. Then the United States will engage that office. One of the things I've learned in terms of the international relations, countries do not invest in a losing player when it comes to the international games. So you have to show to the international community that you are something, that you have something to provide, that you have something to give, that you have some influence, they have a political force that need to be reckoned with. Once you establish, you automatically get engagement from various actors across the globe. I think what the Taliban has done was, because they did show to the various actors that they are a force within Afghanistan that needed to be reckoned with, no countries like them, no countries like their policies, no country like their ideologies, but they thought that this is a political force that is going to be part of the Afghanistan in terms of ruling the country or whatever, and they started engaging with them. That's what any civil or political movement needs to do. We need to first invest in ourselves and establish a political force where we can actually draw attention.
Yeah, and for Afghans inside the country and outside, what do you propose is the best way for them to invest their time and energy in order to get rid of the Taliban and restore our democracy. Some Afghans believe that, naively, in my view, that maybe there could be an opportunity for peace, to negotiate with the Taliban at some point and reach an agreement, and that way maybe hopefully we will be able to secure some of the Afghans' rights. But we have tested and tried that since they have come about as a group, as a regime. They never negotiated with the Islamic government in exile the first time. They never negotiated with Ahmad Shah Massoud. They never negotiated with elected presidents of Afghanistan. And they even negotiated with the international community only with narrow focus of getting them out of Afghanistan. And they, in return, they didn't give them anything, not on counterterrorism, not on anything, on negotiating with other Afghans. And even for 3 years, the Afghans have been waiting, some of the political leaders, to hopefully at some point there would be some negotiations. Didn't happen. So that's one path. Still, some Afghans are clinging to it. And the second is, of course, the arms resistance, as you mentioned, some of the two prominent groups that are actively fighting the Taliban. But there is shortage of weapons, there is shortage of money, there is shortage of people to fight, because the people are tired of war and conflict. And so that has not been able to gain momentum yet. And, I'm not sure whether it will gain momentum at some point, unless one of the major powers shift their positions or throw their weight behind them. And the third way that has recently been discussed among various circles and those who are dedicated to make something out of it and then to hopefully change the situation is trying to stir up people's uprising in Afghanistan, or to cause a revolution in Afghanistan. So this is another way. What do you think is the best way for Afghans to focus their energy in trying to restore democracy?
Well, this is a very controversial topic right now. And you can make arguments for both sides on this particular issue. In fact, arguments have been made by both sides. On the one hand, you have a large group of people who argue that, particularly for people who are outside of Afghanistan, if you live in the United States, let's say, or in Europe, you're living in a much safe and secure area. So, and you're doing well. So why would you want to encourage someone inside Afghanistan to start fighting if you do not want to take that risk yourself and you're living abroad, and therefore from your safe havens, you just want to encourage someone else to start the fighting? And a lot of Taliban apologists make this claim, this argument, but a lot of non-Taliban apologists or non-apologists also make very much similar claim, which has to be acknowledged. But you can also make a very similar argument for the opposite side, arguing that you're living in the United States and in Europe or in other part of the world, and you're safe and you're secured and you can go to school, and your sister, your daughter, your mother, they can go to school and colleges, university, and they can work and they can study and they can do all those things. But at the very same time, you are normalizing the Taliban, who are basically preventing and banning women from working, from getting education, from almost any social and political activities. And they have persecuted minorities. So why would you do that? Why would you basically normalize that kind of situation in Afghanistan while you are experiencing a very different kind of lifestyle in the United States or a different other part of the world? So you can have these both sides of the argument, and in some ways you can find legitimacy in both types of reasoning. So my argument is that if you want to take a moral standing on this particular issue, we have to switch our rules. Switch our rules in a sense that often people who are outside the country, they think they know much more than people who are inside the country. They are more knowledgeable because they went to these fancy universities, got these fancy degrees, and therefore they know a lot about Afghanistan. And therefore they know how to lead the country rather than people who are actually living inside Afghanistan, who are having these experiences that they are having under the Taliban, who are showing this resilience that they are showing against the Taliban. So I think we need to switch roles. We need to let people who are living inside Afghanistan to take all those initiatives. If they want to start fighting the Taliban through civil resistance, they want to protest against it, then people outside the country, we need to be supportive of that. We cannot just leave them alone. It's our moral duty. It's our obligation that if someone comes up on the street and fights for their rights, we have to be supportive of that. And my general argument is, in whatever way people from within the country decides to resist against the Taliban, then it's our obligation duty to start supporting them. And instead of telling them what they do, we let them decide what they want to do. And once they make that decision, then it becomes our responsibility to support them with their efforts inside Afghanistan. So I think we need to change our switch our roles. They have to make the decisions, and then we start supporting them however we can. Obviously, we have more resources. Obviously, we have more platforms. Obviously, we can engage to multiple actors internationally that these people inside the country can, and we can help them with those. Obviously, we can, even if we argue that we have more knowledge and we are educated and we know a lot of things, we can convey those information to them. But at the end of the day, it would be not moral to tell them to stop fighting the Taliban while we are outside, and it would be immoral if we tell them that you should accept whatever the Taliban is doing to you because you're living in Afghanistan and I'm living outside Afghanistan. So I think it's just fair that you have to experience what you experience and I have to experience what I experience. We can't do that either. Let the people inside the country make the decisions, then we need to support them. Just one more fun fact about educated people who didn't do things right. Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, was a professor in the United States. He was very educated. He published books, he published articles, and he still didn't get things right in Afghanistan. So that just have to tell you that just because we are more knowledgeable and have gone to these schools and universities, that does not necessarily make us ready to deal with the challenges inside Afghanistan that a lot of people who are actually living in that country and experiencing a lot of those things, they may know much more than we do, and they can actually make better decisions than we do.
Yes, definitely. But the reality of the fact is also that the environment is very restricted in Afghanistan. It's very hard for people to organize, to get together. An individual on the streets, if they're voicing criticism of the Taliban leadership and they're just saying that this Taliban leader, the decrees that he's issuing is anti-Islamic, the simple statement, simple sentence like that lead them to be arrested, to be imprisoned, and to be killed. And so that makes an environment in a way that's it's very hard to see whether the people of Afghanistan inside the country will be able to get together, brainstorm, and to be able to decide on what they need to do. Of course, individually, we see people doing resistance around the country. There are groups emerging every day. But unfortunately, the Taliban using force or quashing them and eliminating them very quickly. That is very sad. And so I think that there is an extra responsibility on it's not from the standpoint of the people outside of Afghanistan knowing what is the right thing to do, but the responsibility of voicing the reality of what's happening in the country and being able to lead this discourse, this discussion of what is the circumstance and what are the possible solutions to get out of the current crisis in Afghanistan. And so in your perspective, what do you think is the best mechanism for Afghanistan to get out of the current crisis? Is it for us to wait for a possible negotiation, whether it is for us to invest our time and resources on arms and ammunition to fight the Taliban, or to work with our people inside the country to do a people's uprising?
I think we need to work with the Afghan people on multiple fronts. There is no one particular solutions that can solve all the problems. So I don't think peace negotiations with the Taliban at the current situation is going to change anything, because Taliban think they're winning, they think they're governing Afghanistan. Why they have to negotiate with someone who they don't really doesn't have a lot of leverage against them, right? So we have to build those leverages. We have to engage with the civil resistance against the Taliban. We have to engage with the political resistance against the Taliban. One thing I have to mention, and this is very important for intellectuals, because intellectuals historically have tried to avoid any kind of engagement in sort of political resistance in the history of the country. One good example is when the resistance against the Soviet Union started. All of these different fighter factions started fighting, and the intellectuals avoided them. So there weren't a lot of communications going on between the intellectuals and these fighting forces that were actually fighting inside Afghanistan. And therefore, the fighting forces that actually fighting in Afghanistan didn't have a lot of ideas as to what they have to create once the Soviet Union was gone, once the Soviet-backed regime was gone. So they know how to fight because that's what all they were doing, but they didn't know how to rule or how to govern Afghanistan. And that was lacking because of lack of education and lack of intellectuals, because the intellectuals just basically abandoned them altogether. And once they took over Kabul, they did what they could do, fighting, and they started fighting each other and killing each other, and as a result of which millions of people were killed. I think we cannot do the same, we cannot repeat the same kind of mistakes. We need to produce knowledge, we need to engage, we don't have to be part of any particular factions, but we have to get involved in terms of thinking about, what kind of government would be a post-Taliban government, how we should rule Afghanistan after the Taliban. These are the ideas that the commanders, the soldiers, politicians, the civil resistance, everyone needs to know a little bit, and so that they are prepared for a post-Taliban Afghanistan. We cannot start fighting the Taliban without any sort of preparation as to what kind of government we will have if the Taliban is gone. And I think one of the fears that a lot of people are very much skeptic of all these political forces in Afghanistan is their fear that we may have another civil war after the Taliban, and they don't want to have that either. They don't like the Taliban, and they don't like another civil war in Afghanistan, and that's why they are keeping the distance. I think we can bridge these gaps by the intellectuals engaging, producing this knowledge and these various forms of information in terms of social awareness, political awareness, so that we have sort of a prescription for a post-Taliban situation. And in fact, whoever is resisting against the Taliban, whether civil or political, they must know what they are fighting against, but they also must know what they are fighting for, right? I'm fighting against the Taliban, I'm fighting against extremism, but what really I am fighting for? Am I fighting for democracy? Am I fighting for human rights? Am I fighting for an inclusive society? Am I fighting for an inclusive government? Those are the things that we need to have within our mind system, even at the time that we are doing the resistance, at the time that we are doing advocacy, at the time that we are doing the fighting, so that that becomes part of our habit, that becomes part of our moral value. That's once we are in Kabul or in Kandahar and wherever we are, we start treating people that way. We start building government from that point on. We cannot have, again, the same thing happened post-Soviet era to happen a post-Taliban era, where we have a fighting force. Usually they're the ones who are going to win the country. It's not going to be, for example, people who are just going to protest. So they're going to take over with guns, but they need to know what they have to do. So we need to build a broader coalition of intellectuals, political resistance, and civil resistance, and all those things, so that we are prepared for a post-Taliban Afghanistan. We cannot have that if we have all these divisions between these groups. Even if any one of them wins over Afghanistan, it's going to be very difficult for them to build an inclusive post-Taliban Afghanistan if they don't have all these other forces with them.
Yeah, definitely. And then on the leverage point that you mentioned, I don't think the Taliban are looking for any group to have leverage in order for them to negotiate. I think they, the way I'm seeing them operate since they have come about is that they only seek pledge of allegiance, and that's it. You pledge allegiance to the leader, and you don't ask anything, you don't do anything. And the only negotiation that they have done is with the international community, with the U.S., and they haven't done it sincerely. And so with the U.S. that had leverage, they were not sincere, and so they lied on all everything. Whatever they said, whatever they've written, they have not done it. So I don't think the negotiation is going to be any hope to negotiate with these terrorists. So let's see what the people of Afghanistan will decide on other mechanisms to get rid of them and to restore a democracy. You mentioned about the post-Taliban collapse governance system. What do you think is the most appropriate governance structure for Afghanistan post-Taliban collapse, given there may be a possibility of the collapse? I suppose it happens 6 months from now. What would you suggest is the most appropriate governance structure? Are there any reliable and credible research done in this area?
Okay, so just a little bit. I have to talk about the issue of the peace negotiation with the Taliban. Generally, the principle is you're going to come to the negotiating table if you don't think you're winning, or if you think you can win much more through peace negotiation rather than through war, right? So the Taliban engaged in negotiation with the United States because they thought they can win more through negotiating with the United States than going to war against the United States. And they were right on that particular front. They did not negotiate with the Afghan government because they thought they were winning and the Afghan government was losing. So why would you want to negotiate with the losing while you can take all of power? And that's the way the Taliban speak, that's their language. And if you want to join any sort of peace negotiation with the Taliban, you have to first convince them that they are not winning through war or through whatever other methods that they could use. Once they come to the conclusion that they may have the incentive in order to engage in a negotiation. And what I'm saying is, at this point in time, we do not have that. We do not have that situation where the Taliban are convinced that they cannot win without a peace negotiation. So that's one thing. As for the post-Taliban situation, I think we have to think about an alternative to the Taliban rather than a post-Taliban government. And I'm talking about a government in exile or a civil and political force in Afghanistan that shapes itself as an alternative to the Taliban, engages the international community in that way. As far as the system of government and the structure of government goes, there have been really good research on this before the Taliban took over. Maybe after the Taliban, we will have to do a little bit more research because maybe we are talking about the new generation of Afghans. Maybe they have a different experience. And based on those experiences, they may need different things and they may want different things that they did, like, let's say, when we did our research 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, or 4 years ago. So always better research, more research, comprehensive research is much better than less or little research in order to inform our government structure and our constitution or whatever we are thinking about. But generally, my assumption is, and I'm thinking about three things that we possibly need in a post-Taliban situation. First, we need a little bit of decentralization in Afghanistan. I think the idea has become more popular because Afghan society itself is a very decentralized society. Around 80% of the cases, or at least 70% of all the cases, are resolved not by the courts, not by the government, not by the legal departments, or the Ministry of Justice. They are resolved by the local shuras, local jirgas in these different villages we have. People of the village would like to live their life the way they want it. They do not want a lot of intrusions from the government on those issues. It has been a decentralized society. Just for a fun fact, Abdurrahman Khan was one of those kings who decided that Bad Dodan, remember Bad Dodan is a tradition in Afghanistan, he decided that is not a good thing, so we have to get rid of Bad Dodan. Now, centuries after that, Bad Dodan is still going on.
Maybe you could describe Bad Dodan for our viewers who are not familiar with the concept, just briefly.
Okay. So Bad Dodan is the worst kind of tradition we have had in Afghanistan, which is basically when two families get into conflict, and maybe there is a victim in that family, maybe someone from one family killed another person from a different family, then you have, in order to bring peace between the two families, two tribes, two communities, or two villages, what they did was basically compel the family of the perpetrator who committed the crime or the offense to give away one of their daughters to the family member of the victim, because the marriage would bring peace between the two families. That's the notion of the tradition. But well, the victim is a woman, and the decision makers are men, so you already know what's the problem with that. And that has been going on for centuries now. So despite the government's attempt to do that, so I think some level of decentralization is popular, but also works for Afghanistan.
You're saying Abdul Khan banned Bad Dodan?
He did try to ban it, yeah, but well, it didn't work. And I think it's still going on, not much prevalent, but still it's going on. The other thing, we most certainly need a representative government. It could come in various forms, and people need to be consulted with this on what kind of representative government we need, presidential, parliamentary, semi-parliamentary, what kind of electoral systems we need, and all those things. But it's representative government is a very much popular concept in Afghanistan. The last thing, which is not necessarily popular, but I think is very important for Afghanistan, but at the same time, I don't think it's going to be adopted or accepted in Afghanistan, is a form of a secular state. I think religious states have, well, it's not just me thinking, it has never worked around the world. Christians have tried it during the medieval era and post that era in Europe and other part of the world. It didn't work for them. Other religious groups have tried it. It hasn't worked for them as well. And even if you look at what's going on in the secular states like United States, Europe, the more far-right religious fundamentalists get involved in the politics, the more they capture government and power positions in these countries, the more in trouble these countries are. So United States is a good example. Other countries in Europe are a good example. And India is a good example where Hindu nationalism is taking over. So, and in Afghanistan, we have experimented with at least 12 versions of Islamic State. It has never worked in Afghanistan. You can also compare secular countries with majority Muslim population and Islamic states around the Middle East and South Asia and Southeast Asia. You can find that, countries with the secular, with more separation between religion and state, they're doing pretty much better than the countries which are established based on religious manipulation or religious interpretation. Because that's what's the problem with religious states, because religious texts are subject to interpretations. Taliban have one interpretation of religion and text. Ghani had a different interpretation. You have a different interpretation. I have a different interpretation. So once you start building a religious state or an Islamic state, you will start adopting one of these interpretations, which automatically leads to exclusion of various other interpretations of Islam. And if the history of Afghanistan teaches any lesson, that's the lesson that when you exclude group of people, then you're creating a problem for yourself. And that has been going on in Afghanistan. The best way is, I think, a secular state, the state that's neutral to various interpretations of the religion, so that to allow these various interpretations to grow and flourish in different parts of the country, but do not necessarily get into conflict with politics or any other groups of people with different other interpretations. But again, as I said, I may be hated for this one. This is not a popular idea in Afghanistan, but this is something I think that that actually can help build a more sustainable state in Afghanistan.
Well, Dr. Asif, we had a very interesting and engaging conversation. There's a lot more that we could discuss, but I think the time will not allow us to do more. But maybe in future episodes, we'll have you to have specialized discussions on particular specialized topics. But at the end, maybe you could tell us if you have any message to the international community or to the Afghan intellectuals and former officials and leaders who will be watching our show.
My message to the international community, well, I don't have any message for the international community. I'm not in that state of mind to ask anything from the international community. But I do have a message for the Afghan people.
Ask them to cut off their ties with the Taliban.
Cut their ties with the Taliban. Yeah, that's a good message. At least that's the least they can do. Stop normalization of the Taliban. Stop legitimization of the Taliban. Stop inviting these Taliban to various platforms. A very interesting, fascinating story. One of the Taliban diplomats, member, whatever it is, they were invited, and I think, I might be wrong about this, International Trade Organization conference or something in Norway, I think. And the same person went to Germany. So he was invited officially by the government and provided a visa, a passport, whatever. You can come and you can be part of this and represent basically Afghanistan and the Taliban group. But then the same person went to Germany, and then he went to a mosque and talked to the people from the podium of the mosque. And then the government of Germany got very angry that why would you allow a Taliban to speak in a mosque in Germany? So that's a very interesting thing. They allowed the Taliban to come and represent Afghanistan in an international conference, but they do not allow it to talk to their own citizens. And that already tells you, the double standards that's going on around the world. So that's why I don't have a lot of message for them.
Travel to Germany. That is the message.
Yeah. So the message I have for the Afghans is, you do not have to agree with each other. You do not have to appreciate each other's ideas. You do not have to even like each other's ideas and politics and so on. The least thing you can do is to be tolerant, to engage with them, because you have a lot to share. And one of the things you share in common is a terrorist, extremist group ruling Afghanistan, and you want to get rid of that. All these other differences we have, what kind of politics we want, what kind of names we want for the people of Afghanistan, what kind of name we want for Afghanistan as a country. These are maybe important, maybe not important, but you can have those ideas, you can even discuss it, you can even challenge each other, you can even debate each other, but still you can be respectful, you can be tolerant, you can actually, despite all those differences, work with each other across not just any particular tribe and ethnicity and gender, but also across various forms of advocacy and resistance that you're part of, so that you form a broad, inclusive coalition who can actually be an alternative to the Taliban and can be a force to be reckoned with, and can be the force where it actually draws attention of the international community. Because right now, none of us alone can encourage any political actor from the international community to stand with us and fight the Taliban if they think we cannot be a real alternative to the Taliban, if they think we cannot get along with each other and we are not working to each other for the same purpose.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that powerful message. Hopefully, the Afghan intellectuals and officials and leaders who are watching the show will take note. We all need to work with each other in order to get rid of the Taliban terrorist organization that is ruling over our country. And it's not just a service for our own country, but also it's a service to the world. In order to free the world from a terrorist organization or terrorist state that is endangering the lives of everyone, everywhere. And we just saw the attacks that happened in the United States. That is a tragic event in New Orleans. Condolences to all of the families who have lost their dear ones. And those who are wounded, we wish them and pray for their quick recovery. So hopefully then the relevant decision makers around the world would also pay attention on this threat and will join hands and work with Afghans in order to get rid of the Taliban. But we need to prove ourselves first as capable fighters of counterterrorism as we are, and that we have done in the past. We just need to unify in this new environment in order to tackle them once again. And so this was our show. Thank you very much, Dr. Asif, for your time. And to our viewers, this was the episode on Real Talks with Amini. With a conversation, a very interesting conversation with Dr. Bashir Mobasher, a lecturer at American University and at New York University. Until our next show, God bless you, God bless Afghanistan, and God bless our world.
And Happy New Year.